Cassino, Italy, 1944. A young German soldier in a camouflage smock is pulled from a holding area and brought before Allied officers. He's interrogated. Name, rank, unit, standard questions. He gives standard answers. But the interrogation isn't the point, because back in the cells, back in the camps, when the officers leave and the prisoners are alone with each other, they talk. And they don't know that every word is being recorded. Beginning in 1940, Allied intelligence had started wiring POW holding facilities across England and the United States with hidden microphones, recording equipment running around the clock. The prisoners had no idea. They talked freely to each other about the war, about their enemies, about what terrified them and what they dismissed. In 2001, historian Sonke Neitzel made a remarkable discovery. While researching in the British National Archives at Kew, he unearthed thousands of pages of these transcripts that had been quietly declassified in 1996 but left entirely unexamined by military historians. Additional material turned up in American collections. For the first time in decades, historians had access to something rare. German soldiers talking candidly, not performing for interrogators, not polishing their reputations for a memoir, just talking to each other when they believed no one was listening. And what they said about the Americans will surprise you, because it wasn't respect, at least not at first. If you enjoy deep dives into how soldiers actually experienced the war, hit subscribe. Before a single American soldier set foot in North Africa, the Germans had already made up their minds. America was soft, wealthy, obsessed with comfort. German propaganda and military circles routinely dismissed America as a country better at producing consumer goods than soldiers. The prevailing attitude across the Wehrmacht was that a nation raised on Hollywood and jazz could not possibly produce men capable of fighting the veterans of Stalingrad and El Alamein. And for a few terrible weeks, the Germans seemed to be right. The Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. February 1943, the American Second Corps, most of them in combat for the first time, collided with German and Italian forces coordinated by Erwin Rommel. It was a disaster. American units broke, retreated without orders, lost coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. In a matter of days, Second Corps suffered approximately 6,500 casualties, including roughly 3,000 men taken prisoner. They lost 183 tanks, over 200 artillery pieces, and were pushed back over 50 miles. The German after-action reports were brutal. American soldiers were described as poorly led, disorganized under pressure, and incapable of adapting when plans fell apart. Small unit leadership was almost non-existent. Officers didn't know where their men were. Men didn't know where their officers were. And it wasn't just the Germans who noticed. General Harold Alexander, commanding the Allied 18th Army Group, privately concluded that the Americans were, in his words, hopelessly trained and led, and unlikely to improve quickly. Montgomery shared concerns about American combat effectiveness, but was more cautious in his assessments. Either way, the message was the same. America's allies didn't trust their troops. German confidence after Kasserine was enormous. Here was the proof. The Americans had all the equipment in the world and couldn't use it. Superior numbers, superior firepower, and they still ran. But here's where the story turns. Because what the Germans mistook for a permanent condition was actually a snapshot of a learning curve. And that learning curve was about to accelerate faster than anything the Wehrmacht had ever seen. The first thing that changed German attitudes wasn't a battle. It was logistics. As the North African campaign continued and German units overran American positions, they discovered something that genuinely disturbed them. The quality of American supplies. Not just weapons. Everything. Coffee. Real coffee. Not the ersatz grain substitute German soldiers had been drinking since 1940. White bread, chocolate, canned meat, medical kits with supplies German field hospitals hadn't seen in months, unlimited cigarettes. German soldiers had been fighting for years on declining rations, wearing patched uniforms, stretching ammunition. And here were American privates, the lowest-ranking soldiers in the army, supplied better than German officers. This wasn't a morale issue. It was a strategic revelation. German officers like Friedrich von Mellenthin noted the staggering disparity in their memoirs. Because it wasn't that America was richer. Every German knew that. It was that America's industrial capacity reached all the way down to the individual rifleman's pocket. The system was so efficient that even the most junior soldier had everything he needed. Germany couldn't do that for its generals, let alone its privates. And the supplies kept coming. Not in waves, in floods. At its peak in August and September 1944, the Red Ball Express moved over 12,000 tons of supplies per day. Operated primarily by African-American truck companies comprising roughly 75% of its drivers, the Express was the logistical backbone of the Allied advance across France. By late 1944, German armored units frequently faced critical fuel shortages, with operations delayed or cancelled for lack of petrol. American tanks didn't have that problem. That's not tactics. That's systems. In the secretly recorded conversations, German soldiers returned to this theme again and again. They could win a firefight. They could take a position. They could outmaneuver an American platoon. And it didn't matter, because whatever they destroyed was replaced within days, sometimes hours. In post-war memoirs and interrogation transcripts, German officers repeatedly expressed the same terrifying realization. Fighting the Americans wasn't just fighting an army, it was fighting an industrialized system. You could win the firefight and it didn't matter because the assembly line never stopped. This was the first crack in German confidence. Not a battlefield defeat. A dawning realization that individual tactical superiority was irrelevant against a system that could absorb any loss and keep producing. But the real fear was still coming. If you watched our breakdown of what made each World War II army different, you already know how the American artillery system worked. The Fire Direction Center, time-on-target barrages, forward observers calling in strikes within minutes, but knowing how it worked and being on the receiving end of it are two completely different things. In the recordings, German soldiers who had fought on both the Eastern and Western fronts consistently said the same thing. Soviet artillery was massive but crude. British artillery was competent but predictable. American artillery was terrifying because there was no warning, no ranging shots, just sudden, simultaneous devastation from guns they couldn't even see. German veterans described it as the earth opening up without warning. One moment silence, the next everything is exploding at once. There was no time to take cover because there was no first shell to warn you a barrage was coming. The contrast with German artillery by 1944 was stark. Germany had excellent guns. The 88mm was feared by every Allied soldier in a direct fire role. But the system behind their field artillery was collapsing. Ammunition was rationed. Batteries were spread thin across a front that stretched from Norway to Italy. Communication between forward observers and gun positions relied on vulnerable wire telephones that Allied air attacks regularly cut. An American infantry company under pressure could have shells on target within minutes of calling in a fire mission. A German company in the same situation, hampered by ammunition shortages, vulnerable wire communications, and rigid calculation procedures, might wait 30 minutes or longer, or get nothing at all. As one captured German officer recorded in the surveillance transcripts, American infantry was nothing special, but their artillery more than made up for everything else. And yet, there was something German soldiers feared even more than the shells. The Jabos, Jagd bomber, fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, British Typhoons. By the summer of 1944, Allied air superiority over Western Europe was so complete that German units simply could not move during daylight hours. Convoys were strafed, trains were bombed, supply depots were hit before they could be unloaded, individual vehicles were hunted on open roads. German soldiers described the feeling as being watched by a predator that could strike at any moment and against which there was no defense. This wasn't about air combat. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was so severely degraded that it could only mount sporadic, limited resistance over Western Europe. German fighters still appeared, but they could no longer contest control of the skies. This was about what that kind of dominance does to a ground army's ability to function. Reinforcements couldn't reach the front in time. Fuel couldn't reach the tanks. Ammunition couldn't reach the guns. Wounded couldn't reach hospitals. Every movement had to happen at night, on secondary roads, under camouflage. And even then, the fighter bombers caught them. The psychological effect went deeper than physical destruction. In the bugged conversations, German soldiers described a pervasive sense of helplessness that accumulated over weeks and months. Not from any single attack, but from the constant grinding knowledge that the sky was permanently hostile, that any movement might be your last, that the enemy controlled an entire dimension of warfare you could not contest. And the most unsettling part for the veterans? The Americans were getting better. Major Hans von Luck fought Americans twice. First at Kasserine Pass in 1943, commanding a reconnaissance battalion, then again in Normandy in 1944, by then promoted to Oberstleutnant. He later wrote that it was like fighting two completely different armies. At Kasserine, American officers froze under pressure. Units disintegrated. There was no flexibility, no initiative at the squad or platoon level. 16 months later, in Normandy, von Luck encountered American units that adapted under fire, improvised solutions to unexpected problems, and coordinated infantry, armor, and artillery with a fluency that hadn't existed before. The Americans had done something the Germans found genuinely alarming. They had studied German tactics, understood the principles of combined arms warfare, and built their own version of it, backed by resources the Wehrmacht could only dream of. After Kasserine, Second Corps underwent significant changes. Commanders were replaced, starting with Fredendall, who was relieved in favor of Patton. Training was restructured to emphasize small unit leadership. Lessons from Tunisia were incorporated into field manuals, though full doctrinal revision would take years. By the time American forces landed in Normandy, the improvement was unmistakable. German officers captured in France noted that American small unit leadership had improved dramatically. Sergeants and lieutenants were making decisions on their own, adapting to conditions on the ground without waiting for orders from above. It wasn't the German system of mission-type command, but it was closer than anyone expected. And there was one thing American units could do that no German unit could match by 1944: replace losses. A German division that lost a battalion's worth of men might wait months for replacements who arrived half-trained. An American division received a steady flow of soldiers from a training pipeline that stretched back to bases across the United States. Not always experienced, but competent. And there were always more. By the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German officers were recording a fundamentally different assessment. The Americans were no longer dismissed. They were described as resilient, adaptable, and backed by a machine that made them collectively unstoppable, even when individual engagements went Germany's way. So what does that tell us? What does it mean when the losing side respects not the enemy's soldiers, but the enemy's system? Here's what the German experience of fighting Americans reveals about how wars are actually won. In the early years of the war, the Wehrmacht fielded some of the best trained infantry in the world. German small unit tactics, honed through years of combat, gave them a genuine edge in individual engagements. The POW transcripts reflect this. German soldiers more frequently expressed concern about American material advantages than American infantry skill. But by 1944, Germany's own training standards were collapsing. Basic training had been cut to weeks. Replacements arrived at the front barely knowing how to operate their weapons. The tactical edge was eroding from both directions. Americans getting better, Germans getting worse, and none of it mattered in the end. Because wars aren't won by squads. They're won by institutions. What Germans feared about Americans was exactly what decided the outcome. Artillery coordination, air dominance, logistics that reached down to the individual soldier, a training pipeline that could absorb catastrophic losses and keep producing competent replacements, a communication system that let a lieutenant call in a battalion's worth of firepower. What Germans dismissed about Americans turned out not to matter. The sloppy discipline, the casual relations between officers and enlisted men, the lack of what the Germans called snap and precision. None of it mattered because the American machine compensated for every individual weakness with institutional strength. Early in the war, Germany built the best soldiers. America built the best army. And the army won. So here's the question. Was the American system always going to overwhelm German tactical superiority? Or was there a point where better soldiers could have overcome a better system? Drop your answer in the comments. Like this video if this changed how you think about the US Army in World War II. Subscribe for more breakdowns of how systems, not just soldiers, determined outcomes. Thanks for watching.